Solomon Northup, a free man, WHO, disappeared into slavery. In 1841, Solomon Northup went to sleep as a free man. He lived in New York. He had papers proving his freedom. He had a wife, children, a profession, and a place in society. By the end of that same year, he was a slave in Louisiana, legally owned by another man, beaten for speaking, punished for remembering his name, and forced to answer to one he did not recognize. Solomon Northup's story is not just about slavery. It is about how fragile freedom was for black people in America, even those who were legally free. His life exposes a truth that the nation long refused to confront. Slavery did not only rely on birth status, it relied on kidnapping, deception, silence, and a legal system willing to look away. Solomon was born free in 1808 in New York, a state that had begun gradual emancipation. His father had once been enslaved but gained freedom, and Solomon grew up understanding the difference between slavery and liberty, not as abstraction, but as lived reality. He learned to read and write. He worked as a carpenter and a violinist. He earned wages. He participated in civic life. He believed reasonably that his freedom was secure. That belief was a lie America told free black people to keep order. In 1841, Solomon was approached by two white men who offered him work as a musician. They promised good pay and short travel. Nothing about the offer seemed dangerous. White men hired black laborers regularly. Solomon informed his family and left willingly, carrying his free papers with him. What Solomon did not know was that the United States had created a legal loophole large enough to swallow free black men whole. Slave catchers, kidnappers, and traffickers operated openly, especially in border regions. They relied on the fact that black testimony was routinely ignored and that white men's word was treated as truth. Solomon was drugged. When he woke, he was in chains. His freedom papers were gone. His name was no longer recognized. He was beaten for insisting he was free. Each time he spoke the truth, the punishment increased. The law that should have protected him became the tool that erased him. In Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, Solomon Northup, was sold into slavery. This moment matters because it reveals the deepest lie of antebellum America, that freedom was a stable condition. For black people, it was not. It was conditional, revocable, and constantly under threat. Solomon's kidnapping was not an anomaly. It was part of an organized system that treated black freedom as negotiable. As Solomon was shipped south, he entered a world designed to erase memory. Enslaved people were renamed, silenced, and punished for remembering who they were. Solomon understood immediately that survival required strategy. Speaking the truth openly could get him killed. Silence, restraint, and careful observation became his tools. What makes Solomon Northup's story uniquely devastating is that he knew exactly what had been stolen from him. He had tasted freedom fully. He had lived as a husband, father, worker, and citizen. Slavery did not introduce him to suffering. It forced him to watch his former life recede into something almost unimaginable. Unlike those born enslaved, Solomon carried memory as both strength and danger. Remembering his free life kept him human, but it also made his bondage more painful. He had to learn when to remember and when to forget, when to resist and when to endure. Solomon's descent into slavery exposes the true architecture of the system. Slavery was not only about labor extraction, it was about identity destruction. The goal was not merely to control the body, but to erase the past and dictate the future. From the first days of his enslavement, Solomon observed carefully. He learned which overseers were unpredictable, which masters were cruel, and which enslaved people had learned the cost of speaking too freely. He understood that knowledge was dangerous, but ignorance was fatal. Solomon Northup's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. If a free man with papers could be kidnapped, sold, and enslaved for 12 years, then freedom for black Americans was never guaranteed. It existed only so long as white society chose to recognize it. This is not a story about losing freedom. It is a story about how easily America was willing to steal it, and this was only the beginning. When the law erased a man, the moment Solomon Northup stopped insisting that he was free was not the moment he stopped believing it. It was the moment he understood how slavery actually worked. His early beatings were not random acts of cruelty. They were lessons. Each punishment taught him that truth had no value inside a system designed to deny it. His captors were not trying to correct him. They were trying to reprogram him. After being sold in Washington, D.C., Solomon was transported south by ship, chained among dozens of other black men and women. Some had been enslaved their entire lives. Others, like Solomon, had been stolen. But once aboard the ship, those distinctions no longer mattered. The system treated them all the same. Their pasts were irrelevant. Their identities were disposable. Solomon quickly learned that slavery relied on legal theater. Bills of sale, handwritten ledgers, and verbal claims carried more authority than lived reality. The men who bought and sold him knew they were lying, but the law protected the transaction, not the person. In court, Solomon's testimony would have been meaningless. In fact, he would not have been allowed to testify at all. This legal erasure was intentional. Slavery could not survive if enslaved people were treated as reliable narrators of their own lives. The system required their voices to be discounted in advance. Solomon's intelligence, literacy, and composure made him especially dangerous. These qualities contradicted the lie that enslaved people were naturally inferior. That is why Solomon was beaten whenever he spoke of his freedom. The violence was not about discipline. It was about silencing contradiction. As Solomon was delivered to his first enslaver in Louisiana, he was renamed. His enslaver called him Platt. This renaming was not symbolic, it was operational. Names connected people to families, records, and histories. Removing Solomon's name severed him from every legal and emotional anchor he had. The longer he was known as Platt, the harder it would be for anyone to believe he had ever been Solomon Northup. Solomon understood the danger immediately. He recognized that survival required silence. Speaking the truth could lead to death. Yet silence came at a cost. Each day he did not assert his identity. The world grew more accustomed to denying it. Slavery depended on this erosion. Over time, the system hoped that even the enslaved would forget who they had been. Unlike many enslaved people, Solomon could read and write. This skill, which should have been a protection, became a liability. Literacy among enslaved people was feared because it enabled communication, planning, and testimony. Solomon hid his abilities carefully. Revealing them could invite suspicion or punishment. His first enslaver, William Ford, was comparatively less violent than others Solomon would encounter. Ford treated Solomon with a degree of respect unusual under slavery, even relying on his intelligence for labor planning. But this relative humanity did not equal safety. Ford still owned Solomon. He still profited from his labor, and he still could not protect Solomon from the system itself. Solomon learned a critical lesson during this period. Slavery did not require constant brutality to function. It only required absolute control. Even kind enslavers benefited from violence carried out elsewhere. The threat was always present even when not immediately applied. When Solomon was sold again this time to Edwin Epps, the illusion of restraint disappeared. Epps represented slavery in its rawest form, unpredictable, sadistic, and obsessed with domination. Under Epps, Solomon experienced daily violence designed to enforce obedience and erase dignity. Epps did not care who Solomon had been. In fact, Solomon's intelligence and composure enraged him. Slavery demanded not just labor, but submission. An enslaved man who appeared thoughtful or self-contained challenged the fantasy that enslaved people were content or inferior. Solomon learned to regulate his expressions carefully. He could not appear defiant. He could not appear broken. He had to appear just obedient enough to survive. This constant self-monitoring was psychologically exhausting. Slavery demanded total awareness at all times. A single glance, tone, or hesitation could provoke violence. As Solomon worked under Epps, he observed how the law enabled cruelty. There were no consequences for beatings, no oversight, no appeals. The system rewarded excess and punished restraint. Overseers who whipped harder were praised. Enslaved people who endured quietly were expected to endure more. This environment forced Solomon into a constant calculation: how much to endure, when to speak, and when to remain silent. Resistance was not heroic or dramatic. It was measured in seconds in decisions. It was the ability to survive another day without losing oneself completely. Solomon also recognized the danger of isolation. Slavery worked by separating people, preventing trust, and discouraging solidarity. He listened more than he spoke. He learned who could be trusted and who could not. Informants were common. Fear made people dangerous. What made Solomon's experience uniquely painful was his awareness of time. He knew dates. He knew years were passing. He understood exactly how long he had been missing from his family's life. This knowledge kept hope alive, but it also sharpened despair. Each year without rescue raised the possibility that rescue would never come. Solomon did not abandon hope, but he learned to hide it. Open hope could get him killed. He learned that slavery punished not just rebellion but expectation. Expecting freedom was treated as defiance. By the end of his early years in Louisiana, Solomon understood something fundamental. Slavery was not a mistake or moral lapse. It was a deliberately engineered system that required deception, violence, and legal complicity to survive. His kidnapping had not been an accident. It was a feature. Solomon Northup remained alive because he learned when to disappear and when to endure. He did not forget who he was, but he learned when remembering could cost him his life. And still, he waited, surviving a world built on fear. Life under Edwin Epps forced Solomon Northup to confront the most refined version of slavery's violence. This was not chaos. It was not random cruelty. It was a system carefully designed to exhaust the body, fracture the mind, and make resistance feel impossible. Every day on Epps's plantation followed a rhythm of labor and punishment that trained enslaved people to anticipate pain before it arrived. Epps ruled through unpredictability. Some days he laughed, drank, and sang. Other days he erupted without warning, whipping men and women for reasons that shifted constantly. This instability was deliberate. Predictable violence allows preparation. Random violence produces fear. Fear kept enslaved people obedient even when Epps was not present. Solomon quickly learned that survival required emotional control. Anger could not be shown. Despair could not be indulged. Even exhaustion had to be hidden. The body belonged to Epps, but Solomon fought to keep his inner life intact. This was not passive endurance. It was resistance measured in restraint. The work was relentless. Cotton fields demanded speed, precision, and stamina. Quotas were set intentionally high. Failure meant whipping. Success did not bring relief. It simply raised expectations. Solomon observed that slavery did not reward effort. It consumed it. There was no finish line, no moment when obedience would be enough. What made Epps particularly dangerous was his obsession with dominance. He demanded not only labor, but affirmation. Enslaved people were expected to respond enthusiastically to commands, to smile, to perform gratitude. This performance of happiness was as enforced as the labor itself. Slavery was not content with obedience. It demanded emotional submission. Solomon watched how this demand distorted human behavior. Some enslaved people learned to flatter Epps to avoid punishment. Others retreated into silence. Informants emerged, trading loyalty for survival. Slavery turned people against one another not because they were cruel, but because fear made trust dangerous. Solomon's intelligence, once an asset, became something he had to conceal. He understood that appearing too competent could provoke suspicion or resentment. Epps tolerated intelligence only when it served him directly. Any sign that Solomon retained an internal life beyond obedience was treated as defiance. Beatings were frequent and public. They served as warnings as much as punishments. Epps used violence theatrically, ensuring others watched. Solomon learned to endure these moments without reacting in ways that would escalate the abuse. Pain had to be managed internally. Screaming invited ridicule. Silence was sometimes safer. One of the most corrosive aspects of this environment was its effect on time. Days blurred together. Seasons passed marked only by crops and quotas. Without control over one's schedule, time became something that happened to you rather than something you inhabited. Solomon fought this erosion by counting years, recalling dates, and mentally revisiting his former life. Memory became both refuge and risk. Remembering his family kept him grounded, but it also intensified his suffering. Forgetting would have eased pain, but threatened his identity. Solomon balanced these forces carefully. He allowed himself moments of memory in private and suppressed them in public. The law remained an ever-present absence. There was no authority to appeal to, no standard of justice. Epps was law on his land. The courts, the state, and the nation supported this arrangement. Solomon understood that slavery did not exist despite the law. It existed because of it. This realization reshaped his understanding of resistance. Open defiance would not lead to justice. It would lead to death. Survival required patience, observation, and the ability to wait without surrendering internally. Solomon did not abandon the idea of escape or rescue, but he understood that timing was everything. He also recognized the danger of isolation. Slavery thrived by separating people emotionally. Solomon watched carefully, learning who could be trusted with small truths. Trust was built slowly and cautiously. Even then, betrayal was always possible. Fear did not need to be enforced constantly. It lived inside people. What distinguished Solomon during this period was his ability to adapt without surrendering meaning. He learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to endure without internal collapse. This discipline was not natural. It was learned through pain and observation. Slavery under Epps revealed its true objective, not just to extract labor, but to convince the enslaved that resistance was futile, that identity was flexible, and that the future did not belong to them. Solomon resisted this objective by refusing to forget who he was, even when he could not act on it. Years passed. The possibility of rescue felt increasingly distant. Yet Solomon remained alert. He watched new arrivals. He listened for rumors. He noted changes in the outside world. Hope did not disappear. It adapted, becoming quieter and more disciplined. Solomon Northup survived because he learned how fear operated. He did not confuse endurance with acceptance. Each day he lived was an act of defiance against a system designed to erase him. But survival alone was not freedom, and the most devastating test of Solomon's humanity was still ahead. Patsy and the complete moral collapse of slavery. If Solomon Northup's own suffering revealed the mechanics of slavery, the life of Patsy revealed its soul, and that soul was empty. Patsy was not simply another enslaved person on Edwin Epps's plantation. She was the clearest example of how slavery destroyed innocence, morality, and humanity simultaneously. Through Patsy, Solomon came to understand that survival under slavery could sometimes feel indistinguishable from complicity. Patsy was young, intelligent, and extraordinarily skilled at picking cotton. Her productivity exceeded that of nearly everyone on the plantation, yet this excellence offered her no protection. In fact, it made her more vulnerable. Epps fixated on her, using her labor to enrich himself and her body to satisfy his desire for control. His obsession was not hidden. It was public, volatile, and humiliating. Epps's wife responded not by confronting her husband, but by redirecting her rage toward Patsy. This redirection was encouraged by the structure of slavery itself. The system allowed white women to preserve their moral self-image by punishing enslaved women instead of acknowledging their husband's violence. Patsy became the target of constant abuse not because she had power, but because she had none. Solomon watched this dynamic unfold daily. Patsy could be beaten for minor errors, punished for Epps's moods, or tortured simply to reassure Epps's wife of her superiority. There was no behavior that guaranteed safety. Obedience did not protect Patsy. Excellence did not protect her. Silence did not protect her. Slavery offered no refuge for those it exploited. The cruelty inflicted on Patsy forced Solomon into a moral crisis. As an enslaved man struggling to survive, he had learned restraint. He had learned that intervention could mean death. But watching Patsy suffer challenged the limits of that restraint. Slavery forced him to ask a devastating question. What does survival cost? One of the most harrowing moments in Solomon's life came when he was ordered to whip Patsy himself. Refusal would have led to severe punishment or death. Compliance meant participating directly in her suffering. This was slavery's deepest violation, not just of bodies but of moral agency. It forced enslaved people to enact violence against one another to maintain the illusion of control. Solomon complied, knowing that refusal would only result in someone else doing it with greater brutality. Yet this knowledge did not lessen the weight of the act. Slavery demanded that its victims internalize guilt for crimes they did not choose. It created situations where every option was wrong, and survival itself became a burden. Patsy's despair grew unbearable. She spoke openly of wanting to die, asking Solomon to kill her to end her suffering. This request was not melodrama. It was the logical conclusion of a system that offered no escape, no protection, and no recognition of humanity. Solomon refused, not because he did not understand her pain, but because he could not become the instrument of her death. This moment revealed the full moral collapse of slavery. A system that could make death seem like mercy had already forfeited any claim to legitimacy. Solomon recognized that slavery did not merely exploit, it annihilated the conditions necessary for ethical life. It forced impossible choices and then blamed the victims for their consequences. Patsy's suffering also exposed the lie that slavery was about labor alone. The violence inflicted on her served no productive purpose. It did not increase output. It did not maintain order. It existed purely to affirm dominance. Slavery was not an economic necessity. It was a culture of power enforced through pain. For Solomon, witnessing Patsy's treatment intensified his understanding of silence as strategy. Speaking out would not save her. It would only add another body to the ledger of suffering. Yet silence came with its own cost. Each act of restraint felt like a betrayal of shared humanity. Slavery depended on this exact tension. It trapped people between action and survival, eroding solidarity through fear. It ensured that resistance was isolated, fragmented, and punished. The system did not require enslaved people to agree with it. It required them to be exhausted. Patsy's story haunted Solomon long after he left Epps's plantation. She represented everything slavery destroyed: joy, trust, and the possibility of a future. Her brilliance did not elevate her. It marked her for further harm. In this way, slavery revealed its deepest cruelty. It punished excellence as readily as weakness. Through Patsy, Solomon saw that slavery could not be reformed. It could not be moderated. It could not be made humane. Any system that normalized such suffering was irredeemable. This realization hardened his resolve, even as it deepened his despair. Patsy did not survive slavery in the way Solomon eventually did. Her fate remains unknown, swallowed by a system that did not record the lives it destroyed. But her existence shaped Solomon's understanding of justice more than any beating he endured himself. Her suffering was the clearest evidence that slavery was not a deviation from American values. It was an expression of them, tolerated, protected, and enforced. And still, Solomon waited. Resistance, punishment, and the cost of dignity. After years under Edwin Epps, Solomon Northup understood that slavery punished not only rebellion, but dignity itself. Even the smallest assertion of self-respect could provoke violence. Survival required not just obedience, but the appearance of moral emptiness. Slavery demanded that enslaved people seem to accept their condition without internal resistance. Any sign that they retained a sense of justice was treated as a threat. Solomon's intelligence made this especially difficult. He could not unlearn what he knew about law, freedom, or human rights. He had lived as a citizen. He had participated in contracts, elections, and wage labor. Slavery did not merely confine him physically, it forced him to suppress an entire worldview. This suppression required constant effort. On several occasions, Solomon attempted limited forms of resistance, not escape, but self-assertion. He spoke carefully, correcting misinformation or defending himself against false accusations. Each time, the response was swift and violent. Epps interpreted any assertion of reason as insolence. Slavery did not tolerate logic from those it defined as property. One of the most revealing incidents occurred when Solomon resisted an unjust beating. He defended himself physically, believing momentarily that fairness or restraint might apply. The result was nearly fatal. Epps and other white men attacked him, beat him brutally, and left him hanging, suspended between life and death. Solomon remained in that position for hours, his toes barely touching the ground, unable to relieve the strain on his body. This moment crystallized a terrible truth. There was no threshold beyond which violence would be considered excessive. There was no act of restraint that would earn mercy. The system allowed enslavers to escalate indefinitely. Solomon survived not because the system corrected itself, but because it found him still useful. Hanging there, Solomon experienced a profound isolation. Life continued around him. Other enslaved people worked nearby, unable to intervene. Children played, overseers passed. This normalization of cruelty was one of slavery's most devastating effects. Violence became background noise, something endured collectively but addressed individually. After Solomon was cut down, his position on the plantation changed subtly. He became more cautious, more withdrawn. He understood now that even limited resistance could erase him entirely. The system did not need him to agree with it, it only needed him alive and productive. Escape, which might seem the obvious solution, was nearly impossible. Solomon was hundreds of miles from any free state. He lacked reliable contacts. He could not read maps openly or ask questions without raising suspicion. Patrols, informants, and the sheer geography of the South made flight suicidal. Unlike those born enslaved, Solomon carried memories of freedom, but those memories did not provide a route home. Slavery also ensured that hope itself was dangerous. Enslaved people who spoke too openly of escape were often betrayed. Fear incentivized silence. Solomon learned to store his plans internally, revisiting them only in thought. Outwardly, he became exactly what the system demanded: efficient, quiet, controlled. This adaptation was not acceptance, it was survival under siege. Solomon refused to forget who he was, but he learned that remembering had to be private. His dignity existed internally, beyond the reach of the whip. What made this endurance especially painful was the passage of time. Years accumulated without rescue. Each year increased the likelihood that his family believed him dead. Each year made his return less imaginable. Slavery did not just steal the present. It stole the future by stretching uncertainty indefinitely. Solomon's greatest fear was not death. It was erasure. He feared that he would live and die as Platt, never reclaiming his name, never telling his story, never exposing the system that had consumed him. This fear sustained him. He endured not because he believed rescue was inevitable, but because surrender would complete the system's work. Resistance, Solomon learned, was not always visible. Sometimes it consisted of enduring without internal collapse. Sometimes it meant waiting for an opportunity that might never come. Slavery depended on convincing people that endurance was meaningless. Solomon refused that belief. Years later, when the opportunity for rescue finally appeared, it did so not through force or escape, but through trust carefully extended and cautiously received. Until that moment arrived, Solomon survived by understanding the limits of resistance and the necessity of patience. Slavery could control his labor, his body, and his time. It could not fully control his understanding of injustice. That understanding, quietly preserved, became the seed of his eventual return to freedom, the risk of trust and the path back to a name. By the 10th year of Solomon Northup's enslavement, hope had become something dangerous. It was not that Solomon no longer wanted freedom, it was that hoping openly had proven lethal. Slavery punished expectation as much as defiance. Yet it was precisely at this stage, when endurance had replaced optimism, that the possibility of rescue appeared, quietly and without announcement. The arrival of Samuel Bass, a white carpenter from Canada, introduced a variable Solomon had not encountered before. Bass was not an enslaver. He was not an enslaver as an institution. More importantly, he spoke against it openly. This was unusual and risky behavior in Louisiana, where criticizing slavery could provoke violence. Solomon noticed this immediately, but he did not respond. Trust under slavery was not a moral choice, it was a calculation. Solomon had seen people betray one another for survival. He had seen white men feign sympathy to extract information. He had seen enslaved people punished for confiding in the wrong person. Any misjudgment could result in death. Solomon listened to Bass carefully. He noted how Bass spoke to enslaved people, not as property, but as human beings. He observed that Bass criticized slavery even when no one was forcing him to perform morality. Still, observation was not enough. Solomon waited. The risk Solomon faced was not merely physical. If Bass reported him, Solomon would be beaten or killed. But if Bass believed him and failed to act effectively, hope would be raised only to be destroyed. Solomon understood that hope, once revived, could not be safely extinguished again. Eventually, Solomon decided to act not impulsively, but deliberately. He chose a moment when privacy was possible and spoke carefully. He did not dramatize, he did not plead, he stated facts. He gave names, locations, dates. He told Bass that he was a free man from New York who had been kidnapped and enslaved illegally. This was one of the most dangerous acts of Solomon's life. Speaking his truth aloud after years of enforced silence risked everything. Yet Solomon understood that silence had reached its limit. Survival alone was no longer enough. If freedom was possible, it had to be pursued now. Bass listened. More importantly, he believed him. Belief alone, however, did not guarantee rescue. The machinery of slavery did not yield easily. Bass could not simply demand Solomon's freedom. He had to navigate legal channels in a system designed to protect enslavers. This required secrecy, coordination, and time. Bass returned north and contacted individuals Solomon had named, people who could verify his identity and status as a free man. The process was slow and uncertain. Solomon, left behind, had no way of knowing whether Bass would succeed or disappear. He had reopened the wound of hope without assurance of relief. During this period, Solomon lived under extraordinary psychological strain. He could not reveal what he had done. He could not act differently. Any sign of anticipation could draw suspicion. He continued working under epps, enduring the same violence, the same degradation, while carrying the knowledge that his freedom might be moving quietly through legal channels far away. This waiting period was among the most difficult of Solomon's life. Slavery had taught him to endure pain, but anticipation was a different kind of suffering. Each day without news felt like confirmation that rescue would not come. Yet Solomon did not regret his choice. He understood that silence had preserved him for years, but only action could restore his name. Eventually, confirmation arrived. Not directly, but through subtle changes. Officials appeared. Papers were produced. Questions were asked. The process was careful, almost bureaucratic. Slavery, which had erased Solomon through paperwork, would now be challenged through the same means. When Solomon was finally confronted with documents affirming his freedom, the moment was not triumphant. It was disorienting. After 12 years of being platt, being called Solomon again felt unreal. Freedom did not rush back into his body. It approached slowly, cautiously, as if unsure it would be allowed to stay. Epps resisted, argued, and attempted to maintain control. But the law, which had once betrayed Solomon, now sided with him reluctantly and narrowly. Solomon was released not because slavery acknowledged its wrong, but because it could no longer legally contain him. Leaving the plantation did not feel like escape. It felt like extraction. Solomon carried with him the weight of years that could not be recovered. He left behind people he could not save, including Patsy, whose fate remained bound to the system he was finally leaving. As Solomon traveled north, the landscape looked unchanged, but everything felt altered. Freedom did not erase memory, it amplified it. He understood now that survival had been only one part of his journey. The greater challenge would be living with what he had seen and endured. Solomon Northup returned to freedom carrying evidence of a crime America preferred to deny. His survival was not just personal, it was testimonial. The system that had erased him for 12 years would now be forced to confront his voice. But freedom did not guarantee justice. That reckoning was still ahead. Free again. And still not safe, Solomon Northup returned to New York in 1853 carrying freedom in his hands and trauma in his body. 12 years earlier, he had left as a husband, father, and wage-earning citizen. He returned as a survivor of one of the most extreme betrayals American law ever permitted. The reunion with his family was emotional, but it was not simple. Time had changed them all. Children had grown. Assumptions had been made. Grief had settled where certainty once lived. Freedom did not restore what slavery had stolen. It did not return lost years, missed childhoods, or the sense of safety Solomon once took for granted. More importantly, freedom did not come with accountability. The men who kidnapped Solomon, sold him, and profited from his labor were never punished. The law that had enabled his enslavement did not apologize. It quietly moved on. Solomon attempted to seek justice. He pursued legal action against his kidnappers, believing that truth and documentation might finally matter. But once again, the legal system failed him. Because black people were barred from testifying against white people in Washington, D.C., Solomon's case collapsed. The same rule that had allowed his kidnapping now ensured his silence. Freedom without voice proved dangerously hollow. This failure was devastating. Solomon had survived slavery believing that return would bring recognition and redress. Instead, he encountered denial and indifference. His story disrupted the comforting fiction that slavery was orderly, lawful, and limited to the South. A free man kidnapped in the nation's capital, exposed the lie at the center of American democracy. Faced with this denial, Solomon chose a different form of resistance: testimony. He understood that while the courts would not hear him, the public might. With the help of abolitionists, Solomon began writing his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. This decision was not about fame, it was about record. Slavery depended on silence. Writing broke that silence. The book was published in 1853 and became widely read. Unlike fictionalized slave narratives, Solomon's account was detailed, restrained, and relentlessly factual. He named names, he described procedures, he documented how the system functioned daily. This precision made the book powerful and threatening. Solomon did not present himself as a hero, he presented himself as evidence. He showed how slavery erased identity, rewarded cruelty, and corrupted everyone it touched. His story forced readers to confront the fact that freedom for Black Americans was never secure. It existed only at the pleasure of white society. The response was mixed. Abolitionists embraced the book as proof of slavery's brutality. Others dismissed it as exaggeration or propaganda. Southern defenders of slavery attacked Solomon's credibility rather than addressing his claims. Denial proved easier than reckoning. Even in freedom, Solomon lived with danger. Speaking publicly made him visible. Kidnappers were rarely punished, and retaliation was always possible. Solomon had to navigate the same calculations he had learned under slavery: when to speak, where to go, how visible to be. Freedom did not erase fear, it relocated it. As the nation moved closer to civil war, Solomon's story became part of a larger struggle over truth. His testimony undermined claims that slavery was benign or voluntary. It exposed how deeply the institution relied on violence, deception, and legal exclusion. Yet as the war came and went, attention shifted. New narratives emerged. Old ones were buried. After the Civil War, Solomon Northup began to disappear from public view. Records of his later life are scarce. This disappearance is itself telling. America did not know what to do with a man whose life exposed its hypocrisy so clearly. Solomon had served his purpose as long as slavery was the debate. Once the nation sought reconciliation without accountability, his voice became inconvenient. Solomon's fading from history was not accidental. Post-war America preferred stories of progress over stories of betrayal. It preferred to remember emancipation as a gift rather than a correction of injustice. Solomon's life contradicted that framing. He was not freed by benevolence, he was freed because someone finally believed him. His story reminds us that history often preserves what flatters power and forgets what challenges it. Solomon Northup did everything a society claims to value. He worked, obeyed the law, documented injustice, and still found himself erased when his truth became uncomfortable. Yet erasure is never complete. 12 years a slave survived. His words endured even when his presence faded. The record remained, waiting for a future willing to listen. Solomon Northup did not disappear because his story lacked importance. He disappeared because it revealed too much. And that truth still unsettles us. What his life exposes about freedom, power, and America. By the end of Solomon Northup's life, slavery had been legally abolished. Yet the truths his story revealed remained unresolved. Solomon did not simply survive slavery. He exposed a system that relied on denial more than ignorance and silence more than force. His life forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Freedom in America was never a permanent condition for Black people. It was provisional, fragile, and constantly negotiable. What makes Solomon Northup's experience uniquely disturbing is not only that he was enslaved, but that he was legally free when it happened. He did not escape slavery. He fell into it through the cracks of American law. His kidnapping was not a failure of the system. It was a consequence of how the system was designed to work. Slavery required the legal invisibility of Black testimony, and the nation enforced that invisibility without hesitation. Solomon's 12 years in bondage revealed that slavery was not sustained by ignorance alone. Many people knew exactly what was happening. They benefited from it, enforced it, and rationalized it. The law did not misunderstand Solomon's status. It simply refused to recognize it. This refusal is one of the most important lessons of his life. Justice does not fail accidentally. It fails by choice. After regaining freedom, Solomon did what societies claim to value. He documented injustice. He named perpetrators. He sought accountability. And still, the system declined to act. His kidnappers went free. His testimony was legally dismissed. Freedom, once again, proved incomplete without enforcement. Writing 12 Years a Slave was Solomon's final act of resistance. He understood that if the law would not preserve truth, memory must. His book was not written to inspire. It was written to record. It refused romantic language. It refused exaggeration. It forced readers to confront slavery as it functioned daily through paperwork, violence, silence, and fear. Yet even that record was not enough to secure his place in history. As America moved toward reconciliation, Solomon's story became inconvenient. The nation preferred narratives that framed slavery as a tragic past resolved by war. Solomon's life contradicted that narrative. His kidnapping proved that freedom had been conditional long before the war and remained uncertain long after. Solomon Northup disappeared from public memory, not because his story lacked significance, but because it exposed too much. He showed that slavery was not just a Southern institution. It was national. It was legal. It was protected. And it required the cooperation of ordinary people. His life also forces us to reconsider what resistance looks like. Solomon did not overthrow slavery. He endured it. He survived it. And then he told the truth about it. In a system designed to erase identity, survival itself was defiance. Testimony was rebellion. Solomon's story challenges modern audiences to reflect on how freedom is defined today. Who is believed automatically? Who must prove themselves repeatedly? Whose suffering is treated as exceptional and whose is normalized? These questions are not historical curiosities. They are living issues. Slavery depended on the assumption that some lives were disposable. Solomon Northup's life contradicts that assumption completely. He was not disposable. His memory mattered. His testimony mattered. Even when society tried to forget him, his words remained. The rediscovery of Solomon Northup's story in modern times through scholarship, education, and adaptation does not correct the past. It confronts the present. It asks whether we are willing to listen to voices that reveal uncomfortable truths about our institutions and ourselves. Solomon Northup did not want to be remembered as a victim. He wanted to be remembered as a man whose life proved something essential, that injustice does not require ignorance, only permission, and that freedom, without protection and accountability, is always at risk. His life does not offer closure. It offers clarity. And clarity is the beginning of responsibility. After the story ended, what happened next? Even after Solomon Northup's story was written, published, and widely read, the system that had destroyed 12 years of his life remained largely intact. The book 12 Years a Slave entered public discourse, but the consequences Solomon hoped for never truly arrived. Slavery continued, kidnapping continued, and the legal mechanisms that had erased him continued to operate with minimal resistance. Solomon's disappearance from historical records after the mid-1850s has often been treated as a mystery, but it is more accurately understood as a pattern. America had little room for black men who exposed its contradictions too clearly. Solomon had fulfilled the roles society allowed him witness. Once his testimony was recorded, his presence became unnecessary and uncomfortable. Unlike white abolitionists, Solomon did not receive protection, institutional support, or lasting recognition. Speaking tours were dangerous. Publishing was risky. Remaining visible made him vulnerable to retaliation. Free black men were routinely re-enslaved, assaulted, or driven into poverty. Silence became a survival strategy once again. The absence of records does not mean Solomon stopped living. It means the nation stopped paying attention. This is important because it reveals something fundamental about how history works. Stories of suffering are tolerated only so long as they serve a purpose. Once they demand accountability, they are pushed aside. Solomon's life became inconvenient precisely because it could not be framed as progress. His story showed that freedom had failed him twice, once when he was kidnapped, and again when justice was denied. The Civil War later reframed the national narrative. Emancipation became the dominant story, but Solomon's experience complicated that story. He had been free before the war. He had lost that freedom under the protection of American law. His life suggested that slavery was not merely an institution abolished in 1865, but a mindset embedded in legal and cultural structures. This is one reason 12 Years a Slave faded from public consciousness for generations. It was not taught widely. It was not canonized. It did not fit neatly into a triumphant national arc. It forced readers to confront how fragile freedom had always been for Black Americans, even outside the South. When Solomon's narrative resurfaced in modern times, it was often treated as a rediscovered tragedy rather than a warning. Films, books, and discussions focused on the brutality of slavery, but less on the implications of Solomon's kidnapping. Yet that kidnapping may be the most important part of his story, because it tells us that slavery did not only rely on chains, it relied on silence, on legal exclusion, on disbelief. Solomon's life demonstrates that oppression does not need ignorance to survive. It only needs permission. His experience also challenges the idea that documentation alone creates safety. Solomon had papers, he had witnesses, he had a history of freedom. None of it mattered when the system decided not to see him. This lesson remains relevant in every era where identity, citizenship, and rights depend on recognition by authority. Solomon Northup was not defeated by slavery. He survived it, documented it, and exposed it. But exposure alone did not dismantle the system. That required collective will, something America struggled to sustain even after emancipation. In this sense, Solomon's life is not just historical, it is diagnostic. It reveals how systems of power operate when they feel threatened. They deny, they delay, they forget. Remembering Solomon Northup fully means refusing that forgetting. It means understanding that freedom is not secured by law alone, but by enforcement, belief, and memory. And it means recognizing that injustice often survives not because it is hidden, but because it is tolerated. Solomon Northup told the truth when it was dangerous to do so. He survived when survival itself was resistance. And even when history tried to let him disappear, his words remained. That is not closure. That is a responsibility passed forward. When history stops protecting people. When we place Solomon Northup's life beside the broader sweep of American history, a disturbing pattern becomes impossible to ignore. His kidnapping, enslavement, and erasure were not anomalies caused by bad actors. They were outcomes produced by systems that valued order over justice and stability over truth. Solomon's story exposes how societies often respond to injustice not by correcting it, but by containing its consequences. One of the most dangerous myths about history is the belief that exposure automatically leads to reform. Solomon exposed everything. He named names. He described methods. He showed how slavery operated not only on plantations, but in courtrooms, shipping docks, and city streets. Yet exposure alone did not dismantle the system that destroyed 12 years of his life. This gap between truth and accountability is where injustice survives. After emancipation, America sought closure. Closure is attractive because it allows societies to move forward without fully examining what must be changed. Solomon's life resisted closure. His experience proved that freedom without enforcement was fragile, and that law without moral commitment was hollow. Rather than integrate this lesson, the nation largely set it aside. This is why Solomon's disappearance from public memory matters as much as his enslavement. Forgetting is not passive. It is an active process, shaped by institutions, education, and cultural priorities. Solomon was forgotten because remembering him would have required sustained attention to the ways power had failed and continued to fail Black Americans. His story also complicates how we understand victimhood. Solomon was not powerless. He was intelligent, skilled, and resilient. Yet none of these qualities protected him. This challenges comforting narratives that suggest injustice can be avoided through personal excellence alone. Solomon did everything right by the standards of his time, and the system still consumed him. This lesson extends beyond slavery. It applies to any system where recognition, credibility, and protection are unevenly distributed. When some voices are presumed trustworthy and others are doubted by default, injustice does not need secrecy to operate. It functions openly. Solomon's life reveals that freedom is not simply the absence of restraint. It is the presence of protection. Without mechanisms to defend it, freedom becomes symbolic rather than real. Solomon's kidnapping was possible because the nation allowed Black freedom to exist without safeguards. His failed legal case confirmed that reality. What makes Solomon's testimony enduring is its clarity. He did not ask readers to feel pity. He asked them to observe. His writing refuses melodrama. It insists on attention. That insistence is uncomfortable because it leaves little room for denial. Slavery was not a tragic accident, it was an organized practice maintained by law and habit. In modern times, Solomon Northup's story is often framed as historical tragedy safely contained in the past. But the conditions that enabled his erasure, disbelief, selective enforcement, and institutional silence have not disappeared. They have changed form. Solomon's life urges us to ask not whether injustice exists, but how it is managed. Remembering Solomon fully requires resisting the urge to simplify. His story does not end with rescue. It does not end with publication. It does not end with emancipation. It continues in the questions his life raises about whose freedom is secure and whose is conditional. Solomon Northup did not seek to represent anyone but himself. Yet his experience became representative precisely because it exposed structural truth. He showed that systems do not need to be overtly cruel to be destructive. They only need to be consistent. If there is a final lesson in Solomon Northup's life, it is this: injustice survives, not because people do not know, but because knowing is not always enough to compel action. Memory without responsibility is another form of erasure. Solomon left behind more than a story. He left behind evidence. What we do with that evidence determines whether his life remains history or warning. The question he left behind. When the story of Solomon Northup finally ends, there is no moment of resolution that allows the listener to relax. There is no clean emotional release. That absence is not a flaw in the narrative. It is the point. Solomon's life does not close like a chapter. It lingers, unresolved, because the conditions that shaped it did not vanish with his freedom or with the abolition of slavery. Solomon Northup forces us to confront a question that history often avoids. What does it mean to survive injustice when justice itself never arrives? He regained his freedom, but he did not regain the years taken from him. He told the truth, but the people who destroyed his life were never held accountable. His testimony was believed by readers, yet rejected by the legal system. Survival, in his case, did not lead to repair. This matters because modern audiences are often taught to look for redemption arcs in historical suffering. We expect pain to be balanced by progress, trauma to be redeemed by triumph. Solomon's life refuses that structure. His story insists that some harms do not resolve neatly. Some injustices leave scars that do not fade simply because time passes. What Solomon experienced was not just the loss of freedom, but the discovery that freedom itself could be revoked without consequence. That knowledge changes a person permanently. It alters how safety is understood. It alters how trust functions. Solomon lived the rest of his life knowing that legality alone was not protection. Recognition mattered more than rights on paper. This is why his disappearance from public records should not surprise us. People who expose systemic failure are rarely rewarded with permanence. Once their testimony is absorbed, society often moves on without them. Solomon's usefulness to the public ended when his story stopped being new. The conditions that made his suffering possible, however, continued. His life asks something uncomfortable of the audience, not sympathy but awareness, not outrage but responsibility. Solomon does not ask us to feel bad about the past. He forces us to notice how easily injustice can be normalized when it is legal, routine, and profitable. There is also a quieter lesson embedded in his endurance. Solomon survived not because the system softened, but because he adapted without surrendering meaning. He learned when to be silent without believing the lie. He learned when to endure without accepting inferiority. That distinction matters. Survival is not the same as consent. If Solomon Northup's life feels unsettling at the end, it is because it denies closure. It leaves us with an open question instead of a moral conclusion. That question is not about slavery alone. It is about any system that claims legitimacy while excluding certain voices from protection. Who is believed automatically? Who must prove their innocence repeatedly? Whose suffering requires evidence and whose is assumed? These questions did not end with Solomon Northup. They simply changed context. Remembering Solomon fully means refusing to treat his life as a finished tragedy. It means recognizing that his story functions less like a warning from the past and more like a diagnostic tool for the present. It reveals how power behaves when challenged and how easily freedom becomes conditional when protection is selective. Solomon Northup did not leave behind answers. He left behind evidence of how systems fail people quietly, legally, and repeatedly. Whether that evidence becomes history or remains a warning depends entirely on what is done with it. That decision does not belong to the past. It belongs to whoever is listening now.